Let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we thank you for the advances made in the inoculations to cover the pandemic. We ask your blessing upon the doctors and the medical people who brought about that, the medicines, and we ask that we have no problem in distributing it. We ask this in the name of Jesus our Lord. We were talking about Cardinal Newman, and you remember that he was an Anglican who got together a group of Anglicans that really wanted to establish firmly the origins of the Anglican Church as an independent church from Rome right from their beginnings. And when they finished the studies, he became a Catholic following the studies, as did many people involved in that study. So going on with him, he had many difficulties in his life. It was a really difficult life. The Irish bishops asked him to found a university in Dublin, and after many years, he worked on it for a very long time. It simply came to nothing. He was asked by the English bishops to prepare a new translation of the Bible into English, but for some reasons, the bishops finally abandoned the idea. And I think I'll be able to tell you something about the reason a little later. Several of his fellow converts spread the story that he was not really wholeheartedly Catholic, and many believed it, and that really bothered Newman. But that, I think, is one of the things that was corroding the things that he was going about. You see, the Catholic Church taught that the clergy in the Anglican Church did not have holy orders. And the reason they taught that is that Queen Elizabeth I, when she took over, she insisted on ordaining the bishops. Well, if you're not ordained bishop by a bishop, we don't believe that the orders pass. And so the great fear was that Newman would become a bishop or something, and then return to the Anglican Church and take holy orders back with him. That was the way people were thinking about it. And so it really hurt him. In 1864, this was something that sounds really negative, but actually it's one of the best things that ever happened. An Anglican clergyman began to question Newman's sincerity and his truthfulness. And so Newman wrote a book to defend it. His great tool was writing. He was a genius at that. Newman wrote the story of his conversion and his becoming a Catholic. And the title of the book is in Latin, Apologia pro vita sua, which basically would translate into English, an explanation of my life. But it is absolutely a classic. If you're studying English literature, it's one of the best examples of the English of that day. And if you're not studying as regards to English literature, if you're studying spirituality, I know of no course in spirituality that doesn't cover this and equates it with St. Augustine's Confessions. They're of equal impact, very, very well written. He died at the age of 89, writing and serving the church right up to his death. He was appointed an honorary member of the Anglican College at Oxford, and Pope Leo XIII also named him a cardinal. But you notice he was named a cardinal, but never became a bishop. Okay? At that time, John the 23rd insisted that all cardinals be ordained bishops. So that happened at that time. Since then, though, they've made several people cardinals who were not bishops. One example in the United States was Dulles. He was a brilliant theologian in the United States, and they rewarded him. He was the son of John Foster Dulles, an American diplomat. But anyway, they rewarded him by making him a cardinal, but he was elderly at the time, and they never made him a bishop at all. So there was another man, and his name is Henry Edward Manning. He was also Oxford educated, and a cardinal who was a convert from Anglicanism. He had been a worker with Newman. They had worked together at Oxford in the Oxford movement. And his conversion came much later than Newman's, largely because he was married. And only after the death of his wife could he come into the Catholic Church and be ordained. So he waited to them. But he very quickly became the leader of the Catholic community in England. And he was named Archbishop of Westminster. Now, you have to understand, we now have two Archbishops of Westminster. The Archbishop of Westminster, who serves the Anglican Church, and an Archbishop of Westminster who serves the Catholic Church, because we'd seen the reinstitution of the, the hierarchy in England. He was an extremely stern man and very impatient with people who did not agree with him. He was a very strict man. Both Newman and Manning supported papal infallibility. But Newman, unlike Manning, did nothing to help Protestant-Catholic relations define the doctrine. What I'm saying here is that both Newman and Manning believed in the infallibility of the Pope. However, Newman did not talk about it because it offended his Protestant friends, so he didn't talk about it. Manning, that's the sort of thing he loved to throw in people's faces. That's what I mean by a very stern and hard man. An example today, if I'm talking with a Presbyterian, a Calvinist, about theology, I'm happy to discuss theology. I never mention Mary, okay? And they never mention Calvin's suspicion that the Pope was the Antichrist. Those are just things we don't talk about when we discuss the thing. So if you want to be involved in ecumenical work, you try not to offend, and you try constantly to find common ground. In the end, Newman was the better scholar and preacher, but Manning was the better pastor and administrator. So it's probably better Manning became the Archbishop of the... He was actually better at that. Manning started to build a network of the Catholic bishops to improve the education of the poor. One of the ongoing problems in history is the education of the poor. It's even true in the United States. Like we talk about, there's free education, everything. But if you happen to be in a wealthy area, property taxes are high, teachers are better paid, the better teachers go there. If I happen to be in an area where, we're poorer and property taxes are lower, there's less money for the schools and stuff like that. So while we say there's free education for everyone in the United States, there are very clear levels of education throughout the United States. He supported the rights of working people. And this was important at this time because we're looking at the beginning of the industrial age. He interceded with Gladstone, who was Prime Minister of England, for the Irish peasants who were fleeing Ireland. This was a time of the famine. Many Irish peasants were coming to live in England. And he led negotiations for the dock workers in London. It was probably his work, actually, that inspired Leo XIII to write the papal letter Rerum Novarum, New Things. But the papal letter Rerum Novarum talked about organizing unions and getting workers together and this sort of thing. It was all very pro-worker, and it largely came from the influence of Manning. I want you to know in the Catholic Church today, social work is still based on Rerum Novarum. It's a magnificent letter. In 1860, 11 southern states withdrew from the federal union and formed the Confederate States, insisting they had the right to maintain slavery. The right to maintain slavery became the heart of the whole issue when it started, but as it progressed. But understand at the beginning, the real discussion was the distinction between federal government and states' rights. And so did a state have a right to secede from the Union? And the federal government said no. And so that would be what was the principal thing was state rights versus the federal government. And that's an ongoing thing. We see cases like that come before the Supreme Court rather consistently, historically. And that tends to define exactly how they relate with one another, how the state can maintain independence and still part of federal union. An example of that is recently was there was a big question when the beginning of the coronavirus came, and several states saying if you came into the state, you had to quarantine yourself a certain length of time. Hawaii, for instance. And if you didn't, you were expelled from the state. You had to leave. And the question was, could one state do that to another state, or how open were the and the Supreme Court decided that a state had the right to do that. The 4-year-long Civil War divided many churches along the same lines as the state's division. So I think the one we're most familiar with is the Southern Baptist. So that there was a Baptist church and a Southern Baptist. There was a Methodist church, a Southern Methodist. But many, many of the churches, the Protestant churches, divided along these lines. During the war, Christian chaplains from both camps served the soldiers. So if you were a chaplain, you operated independently of the army you were part of. So if you were let's say a Confederate Catholic chaplain, and there was a battle, and one side was fleeing, and you were helping people on the battlefield, the Union soldiers would pass you by. You were not dealt with as a soldier. And that happened to chaplains on both sides. It was one of the real high points as far as the way the country was dealing with things, that the chaplains were seen in that way. At the end of the war, many of the churches remained divided, but one of the interesting things is that war really integrated the Catholics. And one of the reasons is if you were, let's say, a Southerner, and you were fighting in the war, you were Baptist, you were taught that Catholics were crazy and all that sort of thing, well, you'd be fighting alongside Catholics, and your life would depend on Catholics, and Catholics' lives would depend on you. So in the South, the Catholics and the Protestants came to understand one another, and Catholics came to be accepted. Same thing happened on the northern side. The Catholics up there were largely Irish. In fact, one of the interesting things, if you go to Gettysburg, the Civil War, there's a monument there, and the monument is to the Irish division. And the Irish division, I think, came from New York, and they had a Catholic chaplain. And their Catholic chaplain was considered one of the major leaders during the Battle of Gettysburg in the way he encouraged the men and this sort of thing on both sides. But there's a huge monument to him in the Gettysburg field. The Episcopal and the Roman Catholic churches remained united. So our structure, it's easy to prevent a breakaway that way in the structure. You couldn't be a Southern Catholic. You'd have to start your own church that way. You could be a Protestant, but you couldn't do that. And the Anglican Church as well. But each of us has a very strong hierarchical structure. And so we remained united. But they're now Southern Baptists, Southern Methodists, Southern Presbyterians. Also in the Black South, transferred to their own churches and began the rise of the Black American Christian churches, which become a major factor on the American religious scene. So having come to their independence, they're in the South. And so the Southern Baptist churches did not want blacks in their churches. So they started their own. Curiously, when we think of Southern Baptists, we think of black churches. But they founded all these black churches. And we know that they had their own music and that sort of stuff. And the black churches in the United States began a life of their own. And you would find that also in Roman Catholic churches. There's several in Washington, D.C., and many in the South that are Roman Catholic churches, but you notice like everyone sways when they dance, everyone sings, and all this that's basically a black church. They have a very unique way of celebrating religion, and they brought it onto the American scene. It also became a source of a tremendous amount of music and a tremendous amount of musicians in the United States. These black churches became a major influence in the lives of black people, and in turn became their loudest spokesman. So that I guess if you look at the civil rights movement was taught in the Baptist churches by people like Martin Luther King. It was led by their religious leaders, and the churches could speak out. One of the great things about being a clergyman is that in different strange situations, you have a kind of immunity. So if I go into, I'll give you an example. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but when I was in Hawaii, it was really interesting that the Hawaiians, particularly when they're drunk, when they're drinking, just a bunch of men together, you have never heard such anti-white talk, because they see the islands as having taken over and all this sort of thing and stuff. So they really, really talk that. But they don't do it in front of a priest. They do it in front of a priest. I don't come across to them as white. I come across to them as a priest. And so in situations that are really anti-you in many ways, you have an immunity. And fortunately, the black clergy was able to play that. Martin Luther King was able to play that. It's not that, they didn't put him in jail, or they didn't beat him, or all this, or ultimately murder him. But the fact of the matter is, he operated with a kind of immunity. He did, as a black clergyman, what he could never have done as a black layman. And in churches, I think one of the things to understand is that as clergy, we have this kind of immunity. And this allows us to speak and act in certain ways that would be terrifying if you didn't have that kind of immunity. And another thing is they continued to fight for the neglected rights of the blacks, and also they encouraged in white churches as well, and drew money into the care of really poor blacks. As the Americans moved west, they pushed the Native Americans and repeatedly violated treaties that were made. One of the things we've come to understand historically, and I'll say at the time that it probably really wasn't understood, but if you were to go back, and the Native Americans hold something that you would find kind of in ancient Judaism. The land belongs to the people who use it. So an example would be, if I had 10 children and we were able to farm about 40 acres, then that 40 acres would be mine. But suppose my children died off and I only had 2 children, so we had to farm 11 acres or something. Well, the rest of it would no longer be mine, but what I could use is mine. The Native Americans had that. And when the Native Americans signed treaties with the whites, they never realized they were giving up land they were using. What they thought was the whites would take over the land that they weren't using, and they would use it, but they would not take over the land. Whereas the whites understood it territorially, like if you take from this river to this river, and from this mountain range to this lake, that block of land is all for the whites. It isn't that when we have that treaty, the whites can move into the land that isn't used. So there were misunderstandings, but from the Native American side, the treaties were consistently violated. Many churches spoke out for the native peoples, but the underlying ideal seemed to be convert them to the churches and convert them to white churches, a white culture rather. So that a lot of clergymen spoke to defend the Native Americans, everything, but probably in their minds was more the idea of converting the natives to their respective churches. After the Civil War, the Catholic Church continued to grow dramatically, and it was nourished by many, many waves of converts. There were great conflicts between the Germans and the Irish because of the fact that the bishops were mainly of Irish descent, okay? There were actually more German Catholics in the United States, but the clergy was mainly Irish. The relaxed attitude of the bishops to church-state relationship made many of the Germans suspicious, but the church, again, did hold together. We didn't break into two. This idea of, remember, the Irish had come out of a country where the government was an enemy. The British government was all these laws against the church, so they knew how to function without any support from the government, which is ideal in the United States because you don't get fight from the government, but you don't get support. Whereas the Germans came out of a country where, remember, there were Lutheran sections and Catholic sections. So if you were in a Catholic section, you were supported by the church. And the Germans did not like the fact that the Irish functioned as though the church was independent, totally independent from the government, which was actually ideal for our situation. Leo XIII then became Pope. But remember, there are no papal states. The, Garibaldi and the Italian nation had been created and taken over the papal states. And there was uncertain shelter in the capital of independent Italy. They were afraid that the Italian government would exercise too much control over the Pope, but there was no independent place the Pope could go. There was some talk of moving the papal election out of Rome so the cover couldn't affect it. But Cardinal Gianzio Pacelli organized the election in Rome, and he then was elected the Pope, okay? And they didn't know whether the Pope was going to become a target or not. Before Leo XIII, when the papal states were taken, I think it was Pius IX was Pope when the papal states were taken. When they were taken, the headlines in the New York Times is Pius IX, the last Pope. They just thought it was the end of the church. But Leo XIII was elected. Leo was from one of the noble Roman families and very well educated, and he quickly attracted the attention of church authorities. He had several important assignments as he was a cleric, particularly attentive to education and the education of priests. He was very concerned about the education of priests, and this has been a major concern in the Catholic Church since the Reformation, because it was the uneducation of the priests that allowed the Reformation to take place so fast. Unlike his predecessor, he was open to new ideas while firmly attached to traditional church teachings. So he was open to all new ideas, but he was attached to the traditional teachings. We have a name for that in the church, and I would describe myself that way, but certainly the man who taught me, who was Archbishop Quinn, he was Archbishop in San Francisco, and he was one of the professors in San Diego when I was going through. He taught us theology. He is theologically conservative in the idea of the theology. It's all very conservative, and he's practically liberal. So in his dealing, like for instance, if you're talking about the Blessed Sacrament, there would be no denying that it is the body and blood of Christ, that all the traditional teaching we hold about the Blessed Sacrament, he would hold very clearly. Simultaneously, he'd be looking at new ways for people to participate in the liturgy and be a part of the thing. So it's what's called theologically conservative and socially liberal. Okay, that's the thing. And Leo XIII was that way. He set a new tone in the church's approach to the modern world. So he would talk about anything, he would consider anything, he was open to anything. But again, he held traditional views. He made the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas the official philosophy of the church, and at the same time outlined how Catholics could act as good, responsible citizens in secular and democratic states. Okay? So the first thing, Thomas Aquinas, the traditional philosophy and theology. He took it. What was new about it? He standardized it for the whole church so that everyone studied Thomistic philosophy. Now, a great theologian in the church is St. Augustine. But if you become an Augustinian priest, you're going to study Thomistic theology. You'll also study Augustine's theology. You'd study Francis's approach to theology if you're a Franciscan, but you study Thomistic theology as a basis. And so that became standardized. The second thing is Catholics were used to being citizens in countries, Catholic countries, where the society is Catholic and where the authorities favor the church. And what he tried to do was to get people open to the idea of being responsible citizens in a country that did not support the church. Now remember his predecessor, when the Papal States fell, he forbid Catholics to be involved in anything in Italy. So as a result of that, all the laws that were being made in Italy and all the people being elected to offices tended to be anti-Catholic, because Catholics didn't participate, even though the great number of the people were very loyal Catholics in Italy. Well, he changed that and showed them how you can be in a democratic state where people vote and still, go on with what goes on. I think it's very interesting in our own society to see how as a Catholic and a senator, you need to operate within our society so that you could be deeply opposed to abortion and against that and stuff. You still have to operate in a society in which it is legal and this sort of thing, and how you work about that. But it's not as tricky as it sounds, but it was hard for people that were used to living in these other societies. When he was elected, he was unknown outside of Italy and was not expected to live very long. He was older. However, he reigned 25 years and gave totally new life to the church. It's interesting to me that when we have a very liberal pope who's elected young, he tends to be very conservative when he dies. An example of that would be John Paul II, who was very liberal when he started out, but very conservative when he dies. On the other hand, when we elect an elderly man, they seem to be the ones that are really active with these new ideas. I'm thinking of John the 23rd and Leo the 13th. But he was an elderly man, but he raised 25 years, and he managed singularly. He brought the church into the modern age. And I would say, and I think many people would agree with me, he ranks as one of the greatest popes in the entire history of the church. But he came into a modern world that was developing at that time as head of a church that was still medieval. And to put it in very clear terms, he drug the church, kicking and screaming into the modern world. And we have the church we do today largely because of his influence. And his teachings, particularly on social justice, are the cornerstone of the church's teaching on social justice today. And you see the shift. When you have a Catholic government that's governing a Catholic society and everything, you realize that the focus of the church has to be on the royalty and the people in government and this sort of thing to preserve the whole thing. But if you go to this democratic thing, the focus of the church has to be on the working people, They're the ones who vote and all this sort of thing. So it was a dramatic change, and he brought it about. Very often, liberals in all society were very opposed to the Catholic Church. And when they were empowered, there were oftentimes anti-Catholic and anti-clerical laws passed. Now, where we're going to look at this, it went on in Germany, okay? Remember the New Germany? They divided it up. A certain number of these duchies came together and made Germany, and there were a couple of other countries formed at that time too. But anyway, by the formulation of the New Germany, it was Protestant. Okay, it was largely Lutheran in the New Germany that was reformed. The main point of the attack was on education, and Catholic schools were put under the close watch of the state. Okay, so what they did was began to look at their curriculum, and they began to impose penalties on Catholic schools, making it difficult. An example, when I first was in grade school, Catholic school property was taxed as though it was a business. And it was very hard to maintain a school financially and everything. And people who did it at great personal sacrifice. But they maintained these Catholic schools, but they were penalized by this. All religious schools were, okay? That's because they wanted everyone in public schools. And so they penalized it. And they were watched very closely by the state. Give you an example of another thing. I think in Quebec, Canada, they're under the laws of France. And France has some very strong anti-religious laws, not anti-Catholic, but anti-religious. And one of the ones is you cannot have a religious symbol. You can't wear prominently a religious symbol. Now, you and I would know that today because of the argument in France about headscarves, about women going to work and teaching and stuff wearing headscarves, because that's symbol of the Muslim faith. But what you're not familiar with is that Catholic nuns cannot wear a crucifix. And if their habit is crucifix, they normally wear a sweater under their wimple or whatever that covers the crucifix. But the same thing was true in French Canada, in Quebec. They couldn't wear, and again, it's the caprice of the government to decide what's a religious symbol. Like, you think of those nuns with the big hats and everything, they're all over France. Somehow that habit's not a religious symbol, but a cross they'd wear is. Okay, so anyway, they would do that. The education of priests was controlled by the government, and a new priest had to take an oath of loyalty to the state. Okay, so his loyalty had to be primary to the state, and he had to take that oath as a new priest. Now, this was all in Germany. In Germany, a Catholic center party began so that the Catholics would have a vote. And it continued to do very well in elections. And Bismarck, noticing the gathering of the votes, decided to adopt a more moderate path with the church to gain support for his tariff laws, which were opposed by the liberals and the socialists. So he wanted tariff laws to protect German produce and stuff like that. And so the way he was going to do it was to pass these rules, and he could not get the support of the liberals. He was a part of the Liberal Party. So what he did was begin to make concessions to the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Center Party, which was the next biggest party in Parliament, then would support him, and he got his laws through. Very slowly, the anti-Catholic laws disappeared or were often forgotten. They existed but were forgotten, and that's largely through the influence of Pope Leo XIII. Again, he was a practical liberal, so he dealt well with all these people while holding the traditional views. In 1860, labor became the real issue of the 19th century. It's just like in our own age, what is really becoming the issue is communication and technology. That is becoming the issue of our age. But that issue, labor, was the issue in the 19th century. Wages, working conditions, industrialization, voting rights, nationalism, liberalism, forum competition, profits, religious ideals, and radical theories. All of this stuff was going on in the labor at the time. And we'll watch labor unions give rise. They rise out of that, and they'll correct a lot of the abuses. We watch communism will rise out of the labor movements in some kind. But the area of labor is fomenting. And thank God, because of Leo XIII, the church was very, very much involved with all the labor. At the beginning, workers lacked any political power, and owners used force to defend their interests. What do I mean by force? Well, if you take something like the United States, in the United States, we had elections, but owners of businesses could make it practically impossible for people to vote. So they had kind of ways of controlling it. Violence was very much a part of the conflict between labor and business. They would bring in troops to put down riots and stuff where laborers were rioting. If unions were working that way, they would bring in people from the outside just to take over. The unions were oftentimes very violent, and the ways they were put down were very violent. England is where their rights began. In England, some rights were won for women and children, but major gains came after this. I think you know that when you think of hardships, it is much easier to gain concessions with regards to women and children. So they showed the children, the working conditions of the children, and working conditions of the women. And based on that, they began to get some concessions. But over a period of time, a lot would be won. Even with these advances, work hours were very long, and the growing use of machinery now threatened jobs, as well as endangering workers' safety. Right now we have OSHA in the United States that really looks out for the safety of workers. And it has to be a legal thing, because if I'm an owner of a business and there's something very, very dangerous, all I have to do is put a very high wage on it, and someone will do it and endanger themselves. Probably the thing I remember is something that happened to my dad. My dad was in charge of a lot of the engineering with regards to the Atlas missile. And there was a man working on a drop hammer. And a drop hammer, you put in a sheet of steel, and it drops down, and there's a mold underneath and a mold up above, and it comes out, like if you're doing a car, it would come out a fender or a hood or whatever, completely shapes it. And one of the workers had his hand in when it came down. So it smashed his hand completely. And my dad asked, how did that happen? The worker put the other hand in, and the machine came down and did it again. And so he lost the use of both hands. Today, a machine like that wouldn't be allowed. You know, that you admit that's a stupid mistake and everything, but you have to make a machine that will not allow someone to make that kind of mistake. But back at this time, it was really, really terrible. And so there are huge, huge amounts of safety issues, and these sort of things were very much a part of what was going on. Owners were becoming very, very rich, and the laws against labor unions were falling apart, okay? So that they could put laws against labor unions, but they couldn't stop you from forming a club. You know, they changed names and all this sort of thing. So little by little, the laws against labor unions were being seen as useless. I'm sure you've heard the slogan, "Workers of the World Unite," that was developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx taught that history is a struggle between classes, and capitalism had given power to the middle class, owners of the means of production. So he says that all of history is a fight between classes: the wealthy, the middle class, the impoverished. So these classes are at war, and different things happen. If you look at, for instance, the rise of feudalism in the Middle Age, gave all power to the top, okay? The rise of this labor thing gave all power to the middle, because the middle was able to employ people and build these things and stuff, but then all money and power came to the middle. And Marx wanted to organize the workers and then to take it. And so the result of this would be uniting of workers and the revolt, creating a classless society in which religion and the state would disappear. Okay? So he said it would be a classless society. In the whole world, all the workers would unite. Does that mean the wealthy are thrown out? No, it doesn't. But it means you need to become a worker to participate. So if you were a wealthy person but could get into some kind of work, fine. And that would even things out. Like the wealthy would be subject to taxes, having more money. They would pay more money in that would sort of bring them down. And so everything he saw this, and it's one of the sad things. He thought religion should be gone, but you have to remember they dealt a lot with Germany and Russia, where religion dominated and controlled the whole thing. So they wanted to see that. So they would see the two disappear. It's amazing to me when you look at Russia today, supposedly the ideal communist state. There's a level of people who live in a luxury that is unbelievable. And below that, there's misery. And the percentage of people who live in that luxury is just very, very low. And while they think they did away with all those things, if you want to see a czar operate, look at Putin. He operates like a czar. While Marx's view did not pan out, he is considered to be one of the founders of modern sociology, and his views would power and dominate the move to communism in Russia. One of the things we have learned from Marx is that in sociology, there is an ongoing fight in classes. The solution that we see in democracy is the power that is given to the lower classes in voting and stuff like that, and so that universal health care and things like this, the socialism rising out of this can help to even all these things. But it's funny, it's much more present. There's more socialism in the United States than there is in Russia, okay? Now, if you look at something like democratic socialist states, I'm looking at Scandinavia, Denmark, and stuff like that. Those are really, really well-run countries. They're very happy, very highly social. Their taxes are outrageous. But anyway, they're highly social countries. And they seem to be a democratic socialism. It's not a communist structure at all. Leo XIII's Encyclical on the conditions of working people actually shocked people. People did not realize, people who weren't involved in the working did not really realize the situations under which people worked. While poverty and social justice have always been with us, this seemed to many to be an interference of the church into a matter that was not spiritual. You know, when you study theology, and particularly when you study spirituality, you come to the conclusion that everything is spiritual. So that if you believe in God, created all people, that has to affect the way I treat other people. If I believe that God created animals, it has to affect the way I treat animals. I could just go on endlessly. But funny, when the church interferes with the way you're treating people, that's seen as moving outside religion. But it isn't. And so this is the problem that they faced. Many Catholics were inspired into social action by that encyclical, and in almost every country in Europe, Catholics began some kind of social action as a result of Leo XIII's letter. Lots of things for the care of the poor. At about the same time, a movement known as the social gospel began to move through Protestants in the United States. The social gospel is the same thing as Leo XIII was saying, same stuff, but it comes in a Protestant tradition, okay? Walter Reisenbach used the statements of the prophecies of Jewish scriptures and the words of Jesus to point out these same social issues. So in the Catholic Church, things at that time were done through the Pope rather than through using scripture. And so we had Leo XIII's letter. But if you were Protestant, this man did it through the study of Jesus and principally through the study of the prophets. When you study the Jewish prophets, they're very strong on social issues, and they'll speak often on them. In Belgium, there began a worker-priest movement in which priests went to work in factories and lived with the workers. They wouldn't wear a distinctive garment or anything. They would say Mass in their apartments with the laity and stuff like that, but they were worker priests. Catholic democratic leagues worked to bring about labor laws forcing greater concern for fairness and social justice. And Catholics in labor unions all over the world were bringing the teachings of the Church on social issues into unions. And I think one of the things that Jesus says at one time, he's talking about leaving behind, and he says, a good manager knows how to go into the treasury and bring out the old or the new, the whatever's appropriate. And I believe the Church is like that. Until an issue comes up, we didn't even realize we had teachings that would deal with it. I'm looking at the atomic bomb, that we have very strong teachings on the use of that kind of weapon in the Catholic Church. But we never knew that until we had to look into our teachings to find it. In France, there was a very strongly devoted Catholic family. They had 5 daughters. 4 of them entered the convent. At the age of 15, Teresa entered the Carmelite convent in Lisieux. She would die of tuberculosis at the age of 24. Okay? So as a young girl, I think she even got personal permission from the Pope to enter the convent because she entered at 15. I think you have to be 18 to enter. And her family was very wealthy, and the family went to Rome for a visit, and she asked the Pope, just flat out asked him, and got permission. 2 of her sisters were already nuns in the convent. So she got permission, and she entered. Impressed by her simple spirituality, again, she was very uneducated. She entered the convent at the age of 15, so you don't get educated when you're in the convent. It's sort of a cloistered convent. Her superiors were able to get her to write the story of her life and her spiritual experiences, and they called The Story of a Soul is the title of the book. After her death and the publication of the book, she became famous throughout the entire world and was canonized in 1925. The thing I'd like you to notice here, we're seeing the rise of the workers and all that sort of stuff, and as that begins to come to the fore, the importance, then we have this little girl who enters the convent and becomes a very, very visibly holy woman to the women in the convent. She wasn't outside of there, and she died at 24. So she was inside the convent for 10 years. And her holiness was so impressive, they asked her to write about it. Fortunately, she was a good writer, too. And so the book was published, The Story of a Soul, and it talks about the idea of doing the simplest things well and intentionally, and little tiny things. And what she was showing, like if you go back before that, you look at saints. The bulk of saints are kings, queens, royalty, popes, bishops, priests, nuns. Okay, that's the bulk of saints. Well, once you get into this, you find out that sanctity is not necessarily a monopoly of the famous. That sanctity can be achieved by everyone. This book was very, very important. And I read it my very first year in the seminary. And it was really, really powerful about her spirituality. She called her spirituality the little way. She taught that holiness did not consist in great things, but actually in doing little things well. Her approach to spirituality was very simple and very profound, and it spread over the entire world very quickly. We call her Teresa Lisieux, the little flower. There's great devotion to her all over the world. But I see people, light candles and have a devotion to her. But everyone who is really interested in a sound spirituality should read the book, The Story of a Soul. It really shows how simple spirituality can be for any person. Okay? We'll call it there and pick it up next week. Thank you very much.